Okay, hi everybody. Today I want to take you through some watercolor techniques on the holly berries. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm getting ready to show you three different techniques: wet and wet, and wet on dry, and what's called wet wash. So what I'm doing first is I'm actually prepping my wet on dry to paint a different color or a darker color of that green right on top of the dry watercolor. Now you can use wet on dry with wet watercolor on dry paper, or you can use it on top of a prepped surface like I am. And now I'm moving on to wet on wet. So what I'm doing is I'm putting the clean water on top of my watercolor paper, and while the paper is still wet, I'm basically dropping in or touching my brush filled with colored watercolor to that wet surface to create different cool effects. Now, watercolor is an interesting medium because when watercolor meets with watercolor, it acts like water, which means it's going to flow and ebb and flow back and forth with each other, and it's going to do cool things, and it's going to dry in interesting ways. And watercolor is kind of like a wild animal. Especially when you're doing wet and wet, it's kind of like the rock and roll style of art. You let the water do its thing and be its wild self, but you have just a little bit of control. All right, so I put lots of colors in there. I'm making sure that there's lots of variety, and I'm coming in with yellow and just doing a few dots just to add visual interest. And when that dries, it's going to look really cool and interesting. All right, I'm checking to see how my wet and on dry is doing, and that prep surface isn't quite dry enough yet. So I'm going to show you the next technique, which is called wet wash. And one of the things you're going to notice right away, you're like, whoa, Mrs. Clark, you went outside the lines. That's actually on purpose. A wet wash is basically a really loose application of color on top of your drawing or your shape. And so we've got our Sharpie or ballpoint pen there, and so it's not going to move because that's waterproof. And then I have some little wash marks I made just to add visual interest down there, kind of make it look a little splashy and interesting. Notice I had purposely left behind some white paper. That's to show the highlight on the holly berries. And now I'm making sure my wet on dry is dry enough for me to do the last technique I'm going to show you today. Just make sure it's dry, dry, dry. I even think I used a Kleenex or something to make sure it's really dry. Okay, so I'm going to come in and I'm going to load my brush with green, but I'm going to make sure my brush isn't sopping wet. That's why I dragged it on the edge of my water dish. And then I'm coming on top. And the cool thing about painting with wet on dry is you basically have more control. It's like painting any other type of painting. Things are going to move around underneath. You are in control, and you can get in tight spaces, and it's not going to bleed. Even if your brush gets a little bit dry, it still adds a cool effect. You don't have to just do like dark green. You could do like a blue green or just blue. So there's so many cool things you can do. Notice when I'm more painterly, I hold my brush further up, and when I want to get more details and more control, I hold my brush more like I hold a pencil. Alright, and those lines are just